Great princes have great playthings. Some have played at hewing mountains into men, and some at building human wonders mountain high. But war's a game, which were their subjects wise, kings would not play at all. Cooper. Hello everyone. The question of the day is, how are wars financed? And what is the effect of this financing of the wars on general public? Nowadays everyone is talking about war and taxes. And if you think that it is just today that these words have become common currency amongst the public, then Hazlitt will debunk this myth for you. And not just Hazlitt, a cursory glance over human history, which is nothing but history of wars, can underscore the direct relationship between war and taxes. So you might now have understood that in this video we are going to talk about war and taxes, but in a different manner. If you attended any economics class, then you would have seen graphs like ISLM curves, Philip curve, and God knows what other curves. That is not how Hazlitt will explain this relationship. Anyways, graphs and diagrams can be a bit haunting for those who are used to words, as was Hazlitt. He will use pure common sense. He will use layman language to explain this incredibly important relationship between war, taxes, and debt so that anyone, literally anyone who understands English language, can get a hold of it. At least that's what Hazlitt thinks. But most importantly, but it is important to talk about it today so that we get a perspective that can help us make sense of what is going on right now. We are going to refer to his essay that has the same title as the title of this video on the effects of war and taxes. It was written in 1817, remember this date please. Now, since this essay was written as a response to historical and contemporary social events, we must get to know what was happening during this time, or more precisely, which conflicts or wars came to pass during this time with regards to the British Empire. First of all, it must be mentioned, and you most probably already know this, that during the 19th century, the British Empire was in ascendancy. It was behaving pretty much the way the US is behaving now as a global hegemon, albeit perhaps in some critics' eyes, the US has now become a declining power. Anyways, we are talking about Great Britain now at the start of the 19th century. From 1798 to 1802, England got involved in a coalition with Austria and Russia to oppose the French in the so-called French Revolutionary Wars that came to end in 1802 with the Treaty of Amiens. Once the theatre of war was concluded in Europe, the British Empire then looked towards the Indian subcontinent. In 1803, they got involved in the Second Anglo-Maratha War, which was a conflict between the British East India Company. Side note, East India Company was actually the politically, or dare I say, economically correct way of saying the British government, and the Maratha Confederacy. This war dragged on for 2 years, and by the end of the conflict, the Marathas had to concede large parts of central India to the British dominance. But meanwhile, Napoleon took this charge to weaken the British dominance in Europe and engaged them in another long conflict that began with the famous Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, leading to a decisive British victory and control over the seas. But these series of battles will continue, and in September 1812, Napoleon famously would ride across Moscow, announcing the French invasion of Russia. But Napoleon learned something more quickly than the Brits, that though it is easy to reach the invaded land, but retreating from it is whole other business. By 1815, the French army was decimated, and the Duke of Wellington with the Prussian forces gave the final blow to Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo. While this conflict was entering its final stages, New England, now the US, became angry over British naval dominance and thus began the notorious War of 1812. During this war in 1814, the British infamously burnt the White House and ransacked Washington, D.C., but in the end, the US Army overthrew the British Army, stretching its sphere of influence onto 3 continents, achieving success finally in 1815. During this time, the British were involved in other war on the subcontinent, this time with the Kingdom of Nepal. In the end, the British gained significant Nepalese territories, putting in place the arrogance of the Gorkha rulers. You might be by now tired of this timeline, but not the British. Once they got done with the Nepalese, they took to themselves the task of completely dismantling the Maratha Confederacy, and from 1817 to 1819, they got involved in what is called the Third and Final Anglo Maratha War, overthrowing the rulers of Maratha Confederacy completely and paving the way for complete British dominance on the subcontinent. Well, now comes the simple question. During this period of 20 years, who funded this war? It was common people like Hazlitt who faced the brunt of taxes and debt during these years. It was the common British public from whose pockets all these pounds were forcefully extorted to fund these great playthings of great kings, as Cooper says in his verses. Now, is there any complaint about Hazlitt being angry? Let's get to his words now that were written in the midst of this turmoil to explain to people the thirst of these bloodthirsty kings. He begins his wise rant thus. Quote open. The whole question of the effect of war and taxes in an economical point of view reduces itself to the distinction between productive and unproductive labor. It is a pity that some member of the House of Commons does not move a string of resolutions on this subject, as a comment on the measures of the present and a guide to those of future reigns. A film appears to have been spread for some time over the eyes of the nation as to the consequences of the course they were pursuing, and a good deal of pains has been taken by sophistry and false statements to perplex a very plain question. But we are not without hopes in the following observations of putting the merits of our debt and taxes in so clear a light that not even the Finance Committee shall be any longer blind to them. Quote close. Whenever a country goes to war, before the fires are shot on the ground, first there are emotional speeches in the parliament where various politicians justify their acts on the basis of moral and national grounds. The blood rises up in their veins, and the louder they shout, the more the nation rallies behind them. In all this vocally loud rancor, what we forget to think about, or as Hazlitt says, what these politicians want to hide, is the most obvious question. Hardly anyone in the parliament dares to ask the question. Where will you get the money for this bloody venture? Not that nobody asks this, but if someone dares to ask it, then we know what a joke he would become through vile propaganda of the ruling party that he is not a nationalist. Hazlitt says that forget about these jokers in the parliament. Just pay heed to these few observations that he is about to give. These will guide us better in understanding what is going on actually behind the scenes economically. As much as politicians try to hide the cost, both monetary and social, of the war through various means, Hazlitt is simple in his analysis. He thinks as a layman. So the only distinction that should worry the person spending money, economically speaking, is whether this £100 that I have spent will reap a productive outcome, or will it reap an unproductive, even at times harmful outcome. Okay, but a bit more clarification is required, as Hazlitt explains further. Quote open. Labor is of two kinds, productive and unproductive. That which adds materially to the comforts and necessaries of life, or that which adds nothing to the common stock, or nothing in proportion to what it takes away from it in order to maintain itself. Money may be laid out and people employed in either of these kinds of labor equally, but not, we imagine, with equal benefit to the community. Quote close. So according to Hazlitt, productive labor is that kind of labor that contributes to our material comfort. He means basically the expenditure on stuff like medical research on serious diseases, better urban infrastructure, etc., etc. On the other hand, unproductive labor is hiring someone to do something that takes away comfort from our societies. In other words, a sum of amount is paid to a laborer to hurt the payer's well being and comfort. Hazlitt says that they either do nothing or bring discomfort. But even if unproductive labor brings nothing to the market or nothing new to augment the comfort, nonetheless the money has been spent, so there is monetary loss at the expense of adding nothing materially to society. Any examples, Mr. Hazlitt? He was waiting for us to ask him to animate these concepts, because here comes his literary sword of common sense, making such difficult concepts intelligible to everyone, learned or ignorant. He continues thus. Quote open. If I hire a livery servant and keep him fine and lazy and well fed to stand behind my chair while I eat turtle or venison, this is another instance of unproductive labor. Now, the person who is in real want of a pair of shoes and who has by his own labor and skill raised money enough to pay for them will not assuredly lay it out in preference in hiring the shoemaker to run up a hill for him, or to stand upon his head, or behind a chair for his amusement. But if I have received this money from him in the shape of taxes, having already received enough in the same way to pay for my shoes, my stockings, my house, my furniture, etc., then it is very likely, as we see it constantly happen, that I shall lay out this last 5 shillings worth of taxes, which I probably get for doing nothing, in employing another person to do nothing, or to run up the hill, or to stand upon his head, or wait behind me at dinner, while the poor man who pays me the tax goes without his shoes and his dinner. Quote close. What matters is what the paid person is doing and the objective for which he is paid. A person hired to stand behind Hazlitt's chair is useless labor. But now consider this chair to be a wheelchair, and a person is hired to move around the affected person sitting on it. The person behind the wheelchair is doing productive labor. So this is very clearly explained by Hazlitt. After this observation, he mentioned the really interesting observation regarding the psychology of the tax collector or the political party in power, no matter which one. Since political parties are composed of humans, not robots, therefore they are prone to human frailties just like you and I are prone to. One remarkable frailty is that it matters for a person how he earns money. And like Hazlitt says, these people get money for doing nothing. Now, here obviously there is a difference between those handful of politicians who really work for their country and get paid for it, and then there are most of them, like Hazlitt assumes, who get paid to come to the Parliament House and shout a bit and then continue the work of the war lobbyists. They are basically getting paid more because of their lives than because of any productive work for their nation. And once a human or humans get the vicious, pleasurable habit of amassing money for doing nothing, then obviously he, she, or they would just go on employing money for nothing but useless ventures. Just so that this distinction between productive and unproductive labor becomes further clarified, Hazlitt continues to stress upon a few more points. He asks and then explains. Quote open. Is this clear? Or put it thus in 2 words, that is productive labor for which a man will give the only money he has in the world or a certain sum having no more than other people. That is unproductive labor for which a man will never give the only money he is worth, the money he has earned by his own labor, nor any money at all, unless he has 10 times as much as he wants, or as other people have, to throw away in superfluities. A man who has only got money to buy a loaf will not lay it out in an ice, but he may lay it out in a dram. Yes, because to the wretched it is often more important to forget their future than even to supply their present wants. The extravagance and thoughtlessness of the poor arise not from their having more than enough to satisfy their immediate necessities, but from their not having enough to ward off impending ones. In a word, from desperation. Quote close. Now he tackles this distinction from a different perspective. This time from the perspective of judgment on useless spending, or what actually counts as useless spending. The blame game that is often played against the poor by the rich is that do you not see that even if we give money to the poor, they would end up paying it for cheap alcohol and drugs like they usually do on the streets? Firstly, not every poor man is like that, but as is the habit of these affluent people, they employ every negative propaganda at hand to hide their affluence and futile spending on superfluities. Hazlitt gives a very strong response to this misguided critique because fundamentally this is a critique by the wealthy class, i.e., the government, who rather than spending money on healthcare, education, and sanitation, is spending money on killing foreigners in a foreign land. Why make the poor better? They're meant to remain worst. That's what they say. Well, Hazlitt says that what these governments consider to be the consequence of the problem is actually the cause of the problem. A poor man does not become a drunkard out of choice like an affluent man. He becomes a drunkard out of desperation. A person in front of whom the whole future seems bleaker than the present, it only makes sense for him to sap his imaginative faculties that constantly projects pain and increasing pain in future. While these tax collectors sit in their cabinets and drink and cling to the bloodthirsty plan of waging a war. Hazlitt now says it clearly to whom this money collected in the name of tax is going. Kodobin. We have been 20 years at war and have laid out 500 millions in war taxes. And what have we gained by it? What are the proceeds? If it has not been thrown away in what produces no return, if it has not been sunk in the war, as much as if it had been sunk in the sea, if the government as good factors for the general weal have laid out all this enormous sum in useful works, in productive labor, let them give us back the principal and the interest, which is just double, and keep the profits to themselves. Instead of which, they have made away with the principal and come to us to pay them the interest in taxes. They have nothing to shew for either but spiked cannon, rotten ships, gunpowder blown into the air, heaps of dead men's skulls, the turned heads and coats of poets laureate, with the glories of Trafalgar and Waterloo, which however will pay no scores. Let them set them up at auction and see what they will fetch. Not a sou. We have killed so many French, it is true, but we had better have spent powder and shot in shooting at crows. Though we have laid the ghost of the French Revolution, we cannot go to supper upon the carcass. If the present distress and difficulty arise merely from our no longer having a bugbear to contend with, or because, as Mr. Saudi says, the war is no longer a customer to the markets, to the amount of 50 millions a year, why not declare war upon the man in the moon tomorrow and never leave off till we have sent him to keep Bonaparte company at St. Helena? Quote close. Okay, we get the point, Mr. Hazlitt, that the arms of the war won't get us any proceeds. It is worth nothing. But the money spent at home during wartime, at least that goes to the pockets of the laborers, no? We have made him red with fury. Money back at home, huh? To whom does it go? Let's listen to this outburst that would have made scratches on the page of the real manuscript on which he wrote. He continues. But though we have nothing to show for the money we have madly squandered in war, we have something to pay for it, rather more than we can afford to contractors, monopolists, and sinecurists, to the great fund holders and borrowmongers, to those who have helped to carry on, and to those who have been paid for applauding this poor trial, as the most patriotic and profitable employment of the wealth and resources of a country. These persons, the tax receivers, have got a mortgage on the property, health, strength, and skill of the rest of the community who pay the taxes, which bows their industry to the ground and deprives them of the necessary means of subsistence. The principle of the debt which the nation has contracted has been laid out in unproductive labor, in inflicting the mischiefs and miseries of war, and the interest is for the most part equally laid out in unproductive labor, in fomenting the pride and luxury of those who have made their fortune by the war and taxes. Quote close. Tax collectors are self-interested people like each one of us with their personal needs. The public thinks that if they are paying £100 of taxes, they would get, like other investments, some return on it. But no, if they give £100 of taxes, it would hardly cover the mortgage or the interest on debt of the tax collector. Rather than giving a return, the next year comes the news that be ready, there would be a tax of £150 next year. And all of this, why? As Hazlitt explains in a very simple word, because all this debt and most of the taxes are spent in unproductive labor that brings social and political destruction at the expense of monetary cost. If we look at the US military spending in the year 2000, we find the figure of $320 billion. But since the 9/11 attacks, it climbed to $738 billion in 2010, and last year it stood at $842 billion. In this 24 years period, the more the wars the US got itself involved in, the more it got the excuse to collect taxes. Now let's hark back to those 20 years in the beginning of the 19th century and how Hazlitt expresses his or his compatriots' burden. It looks like an extract taken out from a report of BBC or CNN nowadays, because both the UK and the US are facing the economic brunt of wars back at home. Hazlitt continues thus, quote open, in a word, the debt and taxes are a government machine which diverts that portion of the wealth and industry of the people which would otherwise be employed in supplying the wants and comforts, say, of 100 persons to pamper the extravagance, vices, and artificial appetites of a single individual, and so on in proportion to the whole country. Every tax laid on in this manner unnerves the arm of industry, is wrung from the bowels of want, and breaks the spirit of a nation, lessens the number of hands which are employed in useful labor, to seduce them into artificial, dependent, and precarious modes of subsistence. While the rich themselves find their reward for the indulgence of their indolence and voluptuousness in the gout, serpigo, and the rim, so that their proper loins do curse them. It has been said that the taxes taken from the people return to them again, like the vapors drawn up from the earth in clouds that descend again in refreshing dews and fertilizing showers. On the contrary, they are like these dews and showers drawn off from the ground by artificial channels into private reservoirs and useless systems to stagnate and corrupt. The money which is paid in taxes is taken from the people. The labor for which it pays does not benefit the people. A tax which goes to pay for the feeding of a pair of curricle horses or favorite hunters swallows up the subsistence of several poor families. We cannot for ourselves approve of the privations of the hunger, cold, or nakedness to which these poor families are exposed to keep up the flesh and the spirit of the sleek and high-mettled inhabitants of the warm, well-littered stable, even though they were of the breed of Swift's hoy-hoings. Quote close. To conclude, Hazlitt does not have any light at the end of the tunnel metaphor to offer. Because people like Mr. Saudi, who were considered amongst the voices of reason, were trying to somehow convince the tax collectors that take out some money from the war budget and direct it towards the welfare of society, like many politicians do today. But Hazlitt is a realist. He says that the consequent destruction of the nation because of these bloodthirsty tax collectors has surpassed the need of just the 10th or 20th of war budget. Now it requires more money than spent on military. A 10th or 5th of it won't be enough to really make an impact. I conclude, as he concludes, with these sad words, which is do nothing to change the world as it is, but at least let our hearts express their appreciation that Hazlitt said what was necessary then and what is necessary now. Quote open. Mr. Saudi, in his late pamphlet, has very emphatically described the different effects of money laid out in war and peace. What bounds, he exclaims, could imagination set to the welfare and glory of this island if a 10th part or even a 20th of what the war expenditure has been were annually applied in improving and creating harbors, in bringing roads to the best possible repair, in colonizing upon our wastelands, in reclaiming fens and conquering tracts from the sea, in encouraging the liberal arts, endowing schools and churches, etc. This is a singular slip of the pen in so noisy and triumphant a warmonger as the poet laureate. but logical inconsistency seems to be a sort of poetical license. Even in contradicting himself, he is not right, for the money as he proposes to employ it would only degenerate into so many government jobs and the low lived mummery of Bible societies, the pinnacle of prosperity and glory to which he would by these means raise the country, does not seem quite so certain. The other extreme of distress and degradation to which the war system has reduced it is deep and deplorable indeed. Quote close. Thank you, everyone.